Michael Tardogno, golf course superintendent at Skyway Golf Course, and I am on the GCSANJ Board of Directors. Today we'll be talking about what to do on your golf course during the COVID-19 crisis with no golf, no play, no revenue, under potentially restricted budgets and restricted manpower. We're going to get an idea from some of our top professors, doctors in the field on best management practices. With us today is Dr. James Murphy of Rutgers Department of Plant Biology. His research focuses on BMPs and best varieties of turfgrass for survival in the golf and sports industries, as well as home lawns. We also have Dr. Albrecht Koppenhofer. He is a professor of entomology at Rutgers University. His work includes developing and implementing ecologically based IPM for turfgrass with focus on biological control. Dr. Matthew Elmore is the weed science extension specialist at Rutgers University. His research has included exploration of strategies to control weeds while reducing irrigation inputs in turfgrass with focus on using fewer pesticide inputs. And finally, we have Dr. Bruce Clarke, the director of Center for Turfgrass Science. He's also the extension specialist in turfgrass pathology at Rutgers University. His research has focused on identification and control of biotic and abiotic diseases of cool season turfgrass. Thank you for joining us today, guys. I'd also like to thank Maureen Sharples of the GCSANJ, our executive director, and Todd Rash for helping us put all of these questions and this whole day together. So to get started, Dr. Murphy, could you please lead us off? I'm going to talk about cultural management recommendations. While we have this potentially reduced labor, reduced budgets, as well as no golfers on the golf course, what do you see as being some of the priorities during this time?
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here and participating in this webinar. One thing that I want to point out before we get into a lot of details is all of us are going to be talking about what we call best management practices. And what you need to remember about that is we're not necessarily saying everything we say to do today is going to apply to all situations. So best management practices are going to be a laundry list of ideas that will apply to many, maybe just a few, or some mix in between. And so recognize we're not necessarily saying everything that everybody should be doing all in one full swoop here. Getting to the cultural practices that Mike asked me to talk about, he mentioned limited play. And so one thing to think about is if you have adequate staffing, and that's a big if, but if you do have adequate staffing, this might be an opportunity to do things on the golf course that you wouldn't normally do with play. And so think about things like, are there some cultural operations like coring, solid tining, verticutting, scarifying, top dressing, that you would really like to be a lot more aggressive about, but you can't under normal circumstances because of the amount of play. We're in a period right now where play is not allowed, and that is likely to continue for some time. So that may be something to consider. Small drainage projects would be another example. Getting into some of the things like mowing, fertilization, irrigation, I'll remind everybody that this has been a mild winter, so many of the practices that we normally do are probably accelerated this year, coming out of winter by 1, maybe 2, in some cases maybe more than typical. So you're going to have to initiate certain practices if you haven't already because of the speed at which things are developing coming out of winter this year. So let's start with mowing first. Initiating mowing, if it hasn't been started, probably needs to be started. And there's going to be the question of what to do about heights. And especially if you're in limited staffing, what can you do about mowing? You're going to need to come back in some way. And should you be raising mowing heights? And as a generalization, I typically am reluctant to recommend being very aggressive about raising mowing heights. A little bit of an adjustment is fine, but I don't think you can make dramatic changes in your mowing heights in the context of what I think we all anticipate is going to happen. This is not going to last the entire season, so you're going to have to go back to quote unquote normal operations at some point or something close to normal. And so you don't want to be making drastic reductions in mowing height come a month from now or a month and a half from now and trying to get the turf back down to a relatively high level of playing conditions. So small adjustments, I understand. I don't have a problem with that, but radical raising of mowing heights, other than maybe rough areas, I would try to avoid those if you can.
Dr. Murphy, what kind of, let me interject for a second, what kind of savings on labor do you think we have just by raising heights? Do you think we're going to mow that much less just from raising heights, or you still have to maintain that height once you get to it?
Exactly where I was going with the conversation, Mike. So raising mowing heights is going to gain you some extension in your mowing intervals at high heights of cut. So for roughs, it can be significant. If you get the height of cut up high enough, you could probably cut back in your frequency quite a bit. But when you're talking about raising a mowing height from 1/10 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch on a putting green, that's not necessarily going to allow you to reduce your mowing in half or something like that. That's still a fairly low height of cut that you're going to have to mow relatively frequently, probably minimum of 3 or 4 times a week. And depending on what you're trying to achieve in terms of maintaining playability, you may need to mow more often than that.
Is there a height you think we could get to that would help to reduce mowing, or there's really not a height that you could raise it to that we would see a difference in the amount of cutting we would do on a putting green?
Not on a putting green, no. I think you're still going to be very frequent on a putting green. If you're trying to maintain the integrity of the green, which I think that's the objective right now, is you want to maintain you're not looking at a total shutdown for a year and you'll worry about it next year. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. At least I hope it's not what we're talking about here. But on the flip side, I mentioned roughs earlier. That's where, if you're typically mowing your roughs at 2 inches, 1.5 inches, raising up to 3 or 4, now you can probably start cutting back on how often you would mow roughs. But you're going to develop a very thick, high rough, and you have to think about whether that's what you want to do, especially when you come out of this thing and golf resumes again. And do you have time to get that back down to where you normally maintain it? So it would take those kinds of heights of cut changes to really see dramatic changes in how often you mow. The other factor that can enter into this discussion is growth regulators. And so I'm sure many guys are thinking about that, and that chemical mowing, if you will, with a plant growth regulator is something that certainly could help you on fairways. If you want to use it on roughs, you could potentially use it on roughs. It's an expense, obviously, if you're expanding acreage into roughs with growth regulation. And there's a number of products that you can think about using. Some generalizations you want to remember is none of these growth regulators that we typically use shut down plant growth completely. They're not designed for that. The only one that's still kind of available, it depends on if you've got an inventory of it sitting around, is Embark. Embark is very good at stopping growth, but not very many people have access to that product anymore. All the other growth regulators we use are basically designed to soften the injury that something like Embark would cause. And to soften the injury, the ability to stop growth is not as strong with those products as it is with Embark. So you're not going to get probably much more than about 3 weeks of growth regulation with any of those products. Some may be a little longer than others. And, a typical range of activity is going to be roughly 18 to 21 days of regulation. If you're looking to stop growth as much as possible so you can mow as infrequently as possible, just follow the maximum label rates for those products. And there should be an indication of what the intervals should be as well for each of the products. It's not all uniform for each product. One thing to think about, though, with growth regulators is some of them, I mentioned the phyto and the injury of something like Embark, but there are some other products like Cutlass and Trimit that are actually herbicidal at high rates. So if you're using those for chemical mowing and to shut down growth, be wary that you can get a lot of injury, especially if you have a lot of poangu on your golf course, and poangu is an important species for you. Those would be two products to be shy with, be careful with from a chemical mowing approach. In terms of seed head suppression, I'll just comment that hopefully anybody who's got that as a goal in their program, proxy should be well underway. In fact, you probably should be close to kind of wrapping up that program fairly soon. If you're not, then you may be behind and may not get really good seed head suppression. I think Dr. Elmore can comment more on that detail. Another factor that affects mowing is fertilization. I'll move into that. I think the concepts you want to think about with fertilization are to, you obviously have a choice of delaying or reducing nitrogen inputs into the turf to kind of slow it down, hold it back. And I think that makes sense for those surfaces that are in good condition, don't have a lot of injury either from last year or during the winter, and are in pretty good shape. But if you've got turf that's a little hungry, a little thin for whatever reason, holding back on the nitrogen is potentially going to put you behind. And it's not so much a problem for next week, but that will be a problem when you come out of these restrictions and you want to restore the turf back into good playing conditions once golf resumes. If the turf is still thin in May or especially June, July, if it lasts that long, these restrictions, then you're going to be trying to push that turf at a time where it's really not a good idea to be doing that with nitrogen. So you need to think about where your turf is at as a manager. Are you happy with the condition it is in or not? If it is in good condition, you can probably do some reductions either in rates or frequency of applications. But if you have weak turf, I would advise that maybe you don't want to do that. I think Dr. Clarke will probably touch on that relative to diseases, especially anthracnose. Cutting back on poannuate turf that suffers from anthracnose, that could be setting you up for some significant problems in the summer. I'll let Dr. Clarke elaborate on that.
Dr. Murphy, before you move on any further, there was a question that we had fielded. You talked about using PGRs, and you talked about should have already put seed head suppression apps out, but there was a wondering, with reduced budgets and reduced labor, would it be a good idea or not a good idea to possibly repurpose proxy applications that normally go out on greens, tees, and fairways for seed head and use them in potentially roughs around trees, around greens and bunker banks? Would that be a good idea, or will that put us too far behind with health of the plant on greens and tees?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's several ways to look at it. The way you did is going to put the turf you take it away from them at jeopardy, and that is a possibility. Another thing you want to be mindful about is proxy isn't the best growth regulator for vegetative suppression. It will suppress vegetative growth some, but it actually does other things in terms of plant growth regulation much better, like seed head control, than it does at vegetative suppression. So using it for the roughs and bunker breaks, you certainly could, but you're not going to get as big a bang for your buck in mowing reduction with proxy as you would, say, a Primo or some other growth regulator. So you certainly could attempt the repurposing as the question suggests, but you may not be as satisfied with the growth reduction with proxy in the rough areas, bunker faces and things like that, as you would if you'd used a different growth regulator like Primo, for example. And then the other, the question I think that you mentioned had the perspective is going to take away from the turf that you were using it for, such as seed head control and poannua. And yeah, it will. It'll put out a lot of seed. A lot of the seed may be very useful if you're trying to, get areas to fill in with poannua. But a lot of our work in anthracnose has shown that seed head suppression, growth regulation benefits the health of poannua. So you run the risk. I'm not sure it's a great risk, but it is a risk that you could be weakening the poannua, allowing it to go into seed head production, producing a whole lot of seed heads, and then headed into summer being a little bit weaker. and not as strong because of the fact that it puts so much energy into producing seed heads. So that would be a consequence that you need to be prepared for if you did that repurposing.
Also on the PGRs, Dr. Murphy, you talked about how a lot of these PGRs won't actually shut the plant down. They'll just slow growth, unlike embark that can actually shut the plant down. And you said use higher rates if you're trying to slow that growth and reduce mowing. Can we use too much PGR? I've had some conversations with other superintendents where they said, I'm going to try to shut my plant down. I'm going to spray the highest rate at the shortest interval possible according to the label. Is there any problems with that that we would see? Can we damage the turf? Can we put it in a bad place going into heat of the summer when we might open up, or even mixing with other chemicals such as DMIs?
Yes, I'm going to defer to my colleagues about some of the specific pest issues that could be related to that kind of strategy. You know, Dr. Clarke and Dr. Elmore can talk about diseases and weeds, potential response to that. But what I feel that you also need to think about with those kinds of programs is, I think we all recognize that there's a rebound effect at the end of the growth regulation cycle. And so with really high rates and trying to extend the interval as far as possible, if you do get in a situation where you allow it to come out of regulation, you could get a really tremendous burst in growth. It'll actually come out and look really good at first, but the growth rate will really rebound quite dramatically. And you need to think about that, because not that you can't deal with that and manage it, but if you don't have the staffing to keep up with the mowing and it comes out of regulation, things could get a little crazy in terms of mowing management if it's really highly regulated for a long period of time, and for whatever reason it comes out of growth regulation. You can get a significant rebound in growth rate. So you get this big surge and you can make a mess of things if you can't keep up with the mowing at that point. So that's kind of a real practical problem that you have to be mentally prepared for with that kind of strategy.
Okay.
Bruce, do you want to chime in, or Matt, on any of since that topic has come up now about either diseases or potentially weed issues related to that very aggressive use of growth regulator?
I mean, I can comment in terms of the annual bluegrass suppression. And I guess the thing to keep in mind also is that, you know, those reapplication intervals, you can use growing degree days to determine when the appropriate reapplication interval is. And there's lots of different apps and things out there to be able to do that. And there's information on some product labels, but I guess keep that in mind, especially, you know, if you're getting aggressive, so that you can avoid that heavy rebound. In terms of, you know, plant growth regulators and their effect on annual bluegrass, I mean, you could look at this two ways. You know, one is potentially an opportunity to go after annual bluegrass a little bit with some of these PGRs like Cutlass or Trim It. And especially in fairways, you know, you want to be careful on greens, but there may be an opportunity to do that. It definitely depends a little bit on, you know, how well the annual bluegrass is mixed with the bent grass, but it could be one of those things where, you know, in the past you've been hesitant to utilize Trim It or Cutlass because you don't want the golfers to see the annual bluegrass kind of yellowing and being kind of depressed within the canopy, because it'll reduce playing conditions. But the spring is actually a good time to start on one of these, you know, Trim It or Cutlass programs if you would like. The rate is really going to depend on, you know, how much annual bluegrass do you have. You know, if you've got, you know, 50% annual bluegrass and it's large patches of annual bluegrass not mixed very well with the bent grass or whatever it is your desirable grass is, you would want to be really cautious with the rates, and you probably, you know, can't anticipate a whole lot of progress necessarily. But if you're, you know, maybe around 30% or 20% annual bluegrass, and it seems like it's mixed really well with the bent grass, and then if you can really kind of shut that annual bluegrass down, then the bent grass would kind of creep in. I think there's an opportunity there. You know, I would just be cautious you don't you don't want to be shutting down annual bluegrass to the point that that you're leaving bare ground and the bent grass isn't filling in, you know. So because you end up with bare ground going into summer, you're going to be in trouble in terms of annual weeds like crabgrass and goosegrass that are going to find those voids in the canopy. So again, it may be an opportunity to switch up those PGRs a little bit. You know, you can always mix primo in there if you don't want to regulate too much with trim it or cutlass and you're worried about annual bluegrass. You know, you can mix those kind of things together. But yeah, it could be an opportunity.
I'll mention something as well along those lines. If you're talking about PGR use, and I know a lot of superintendents are talking about aggressively using PGRs for the purposes that Jim Murphy and Matt Elmore just talked about, that's fine. And it really, from the standpoint of disease, there's not a real downside of that for most cases, except for the fact that if you do have breakthroughs in your disease control program and you're really severely regulating your turf, you're going to take a lot longer to grow out of those symptoms. So that's something to be considered about. The other thing which you may want to think about, especially on fairways, with the aggressive use of trim it, very short intervals, very high rates. This is, I agree with Matt, an opportunity to reduce your POA populations when there is no play. But you also realize in the short term, there's probably not much of a price to pay. But if this goes on for a long period of time, you will in fact reduce or actually increase the potential for DMI resistance in terms of DMI fungicide resistance, since Trimit is extremely closely associated, very similar to DMIs in chemistry. And so long-term use, aggressive use of Trimit at short intervals, high rates can lead to enhanced DMI resistance.
Dr. Clarke, is that DMIs across the board, all DMIs, or some of these new formulations, are they going to be different?
That's a good question. I mean, there are a lot of DMIs out there. Basically, all DMIs work the same way. They're demethylation inhibitors, and essentially what they do is they reduce steroid biosynthesis. And so essentially, you have potential for resistance. You can have cross resistance even with the newer ones. I will say this, some of the newer ones and some of the newer DMIs, such as Maxdema, we have seen much less PGR effects. And I would think in many cases, it's probably maybe a little less likely to see some of the cross resistance issues in the short run, but in the long run, if you have resistance DMIs, you have cross resistance to all of the DMIs.
I think we'll get back to Dr. Murphy.
Okay.
You finish up on where you were, trying to move you on. We haven't talked yet about benefits of top dressing. Is this a time to do more, less? Is this a cost we can cut? Or is this something that may help us reduce staff and mowing?
So I think top dressing on putting greens is critical to maintain it, because you want to maintain the integrity of the surface. In fact, I would argue this is one of those opportunities to maybe do more because of the limited play. And if you've fallen behind in a program and you need to do some catch up, try to get more sand into the surface by combining it with solid tining or even a hollow tine if you think you have the resources to handle pulling cores. So I think top dressing from my point of view on putting greens would be to do more of it if you possibly can for that reason. And the other thing is if you're going to, I think Dr. Clarke is going to talk more about the fungicide management issues, but I think he's going to emphasize that if you do best management practices, raise your cutting height slightly, increase your nitrogen fertility, or at least keep it at an adequate level, and you top dress routinely on putting greens, we've seen through James Hempling's research here that you can really cut back on the fungicides and treat anthracnose in a curative mode. And so if your focus is on saving money, that's something to think about, is do you want to take that approach? And using best management practices is more likely to be palatable right now because you don't have the play and the demand of having balls roll 13 foot on a stimp meter reading on your putting greens. So think about that as a potential opportunity, and top dressing is an integral part of that program to manage anthracnose. The other thing that we haven't talked about is irrigation and irrigation is something that we're not thinking a whole lot about right now because it keeps raining. But if this drags on for weeks and weeks and you start getting into some dry periods and you're reduced staffing, you want to make sure your irrigation system is functioning well. So this would be a good time to make sure it's up and running and do some checks where you can, because you may be stuck in a situation where you don't have the staffing to do a lot of the hand watering you used to do. And therefore, you're going to be more reliant on that automatic system. So making sure that it's functioning in a way that you're satisfied and happy that it's working is really important. So a little bit of foresight right now might help out with a little reducing some of the anxiety once it starts to get hot and dry here in the coming months.
Well, we're on irrigation, Dr. Murphy. Assuming worst case scenario, little to no golf this summer, and the thought of cutting costs again, is wetting agent something you would think maybe we could cut it out and not waste money on it or spend money on it due to the fact that we can get out and hand water more with no play out there, or run irrigation just kind of more freely, not worrying about play? Or, you know, is a wetting agent something that might help us to reduce labor?
Yeah, you could look at that two different ways, as you just described, Mike. You could look at it as a potential cost savings, and because you're going to be potentially able to do more watering when it's needed rather than waiting for play to get out of the way. You could make the argument that you don't need the benefits of a wetting agent to help you get through that kind of, well, I need to water, but I can't do it now, I have to do it later. And the wetting agent helps you get through that period. You could also look at it from the standpoint, though, that if you've got a golf course, not everybody has this type of golf course, but if you have a golf course that has some pretty stubborn localized dry spot problems, there aren't a lot in New Jersey compared to other places across the country, but there are people that struggle with localized dry spots. And so if you're prone to that problem, year in, year out kind of thing, then you may want to be a little bit more cautious about dropping the wetting agent out of your program. But if you don't typically suffer from localized dry spot, I think the other perspective certainly applies, where you might have a cost savings by dropping it out. But you may have to be a little bit more careful about your hand watering and automatic watering, and make sure it's uniform.
In line with some of the other things we've already talked about, you know, kind of not changing your typical routine. If we get into summer, we don't have play, would it be wise or unwise to kind of throw water a little less frugal? Just kind of, you know, I'm not worried about green speeds, or I'm not worried about firm fairways, so maybe I'm not so worried about wet spots, and I'll just let the overheads run.
Yeah, so I think that approach applies really well to guys that are very frugal, usually with water, and tend to run things on a very dry side. I think this is your opportunity to run a little bit more water. I'm not saying flood the place, but it will, if you especially are under a budget restriction, staffing restriction especially, and you don't have the time to chase after dry spots, I think you probably would be better served to run a little bit more water through either automatic irrigation or hand watering to prevent those issues from becoming catastrophic. So I think for programs that typically are very, very dry, this might be the time to kind of step away from that kind of approach and be a little bit more liberal with your water. But for the golf courses that are normally very wet, I would say that may not be such the best approach, because you're already wet to begin with. So being wetter is not necessarily a good thing. So it would be case by case, golf course by golf course, as to what I would suggest. But again, for those guys that can keep their golf course very dry and do keep it dry, I think for the next weeks or months that come, you want to be a little careful about that, especially if you're short-staffed.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. I think moving on, we'll go to Dr. Elmore and talk about weed control recommendations. Same thing, basing your ideas on reduced labor, reduced budgets. What do you foresee for us?
Yeah, so I mean, basically what you're going to have to do, I think, is prioritize weed control. And so I kind of group weeds into two classes. You've got your annuals and your perennials. And so if you're in a budget crunch or labor crunch, I think prioritizing annual weed control is going to be the most important thing. And then you could potentially move perennial weed control a little bit farther down the list. And the reason for that is just, annual weeds, if not controlled, are going to set the turf grass back to a much greater degree than a perennial weed. You think about an unchecked crabgrass or goosegrass infestation. That's going to result in severely thin turf if we get to the fall. Whereas, if you say you've got something like Dallas grass or Bermuda grass, in roughs or even in fairways, those weeds, or even another one would be Kalinga. Those weeds are perennial, so they're certainly problematic and certainly tough to control, but they're not likely to move as quickly throughout the property and kind of devastate things that way. So again, I'd prioritize annual weed control. And if you're thinking about being budget conscious, pre-emergence herbicides that you're probably already using are going to be the most economic form of annual weed control, much more economic than relying strictly on post-emergence herbicides. Certainly you want to keep some post-emergence herbicides around for escapes and things like that, but now is not the time to cut pre-emergence weed control out of your budget. I don't suggest that anyone do anything drastic with it, in terms of pre-emergence rates. For example, if you've used a particular rate of a pre-emergence herbicide for years and it works pretty well most of the time, but sometimes you get some breakthrough if we have a rainy year or whatever. I wouldn't necessarily do anything drastic to increase rates to think, oh, well, I'm going to get more weed control if I increase rates. That would be especially the case in fine turf, fairways and approaches and that kind of thing, because you might compromise the rooting of the turf grass or something like that. So, that would be my recommendation for annual weeds. The other thing is, keep a couple post-emergence herbicides around that work well. And if you have the ability to, try and maybe you've got more time on the course without golfers, so potentially you could scout for some of these weed problems if the pre-emergence herbicides start to break through. Assuming worst case scenario, we're still closed in June or July. The biggest thing with post-emergence weed control that we see a lot of times with goosegrass, which is becoming more problematic, is that if you wait till it's got 5 or 7 tillers on it in mid-July, then it's, especially in bentgrass, it's really tough to control it because of the herbicides we use. The rates have to be low on bentgrass so that they're safe. And usually the plant may be too big for that low rate to provide control. Certainly in roughs, maybe there's an opportunity with crabgrass or goosegrass to wait a little bit longer if you have problems with your pre-emergence, because in non-bentgrass turf, you can use higher rates of these products in controlled tillered plants. I wouldn't wait till they start producing seed, but again, that's probably a worst case scenario. I'd really consider what Dr. Murphy mentioned about nitrogen rates and trying to create a dense stand of turf grass right now. Increasing mowing heights slightly in roughs could potentially help mitigate some of these weed infestations. Again, I don't think increasing heights in fairways or anything is necessarily a good idea, or strictly on the basis of weed control. Again, we want to be careful with the rate increases.
Dr. Elmore, to that thought, I'm sorry, talking about rate increases, and we've also talked about superintendents that may be experimenting with PGR rate increases. Can we see damage to the turf by potentially making a bad mix of too much pre-emergent along with too much growth regulator?
Yeah, I certainly think so. Not necessarily there's a specific interaction of pre-emergence herbicides and PGRs, but now's not the time to be playing mad scientist, on large areas of your golf course. I think sticking with labeled rates or rates that you have experience with. If you're trying out a trim-it program, you could start with a rate that you're comfortable with and slowly increase that if you feel like you need more annual bluegrass suppression. Well, I guess one thing to mention in terms of those PGRs, and if we're talking about targeting annual bluegrass, is you want to be sure or have a handle on annual bluegrass weevil, because, and Dr. Koppenhofer can talk about this, but one of the things we've seen is that if you mix a PGR like trim-it in combination with an unchecked annual bluegrass weevil population, the damage to the annual bluegrass can be severe, and it can really show up in a matter of, a week. So you'd want to be careful, again, if you're going to get aggressive with the PGRs, that either you're controlling weevils or you've at least got some sort of strategy in place. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a good point. We don't need to be doing anything drastic with herbicide rates. So, the only area I might want to increase rates if I've had problems in the past with pre-emergence is maybe in the roughs, but it wouldn't be very much of a, I wouldn't increase that rate very much, and you definitely want to stay within the label. So,
do we have any? Could you tell us about infescues, native areas, unmowed areas?
Yeah.
Is there anything we can do out there? I've talked with some superintendents who said maybe I'm just going to leave them alone, and save money and save labor. But is that something that could get us into trouble? Could we wind up with weed infestations that cause us trouble down the road? And is there a way possibly to deal with those fescues without maybe throwing money at them chemically?
Yeah. There certainly are ways to, I don't advocate for letting them go. I think it's hopefully an opportunity to maybe take stock of what weeds you have in those areas. And again, I would prioritize the annual weeds over the perennials. Those annuals are going to spread via seed, and something like foxtails and American burnweed, those sorts of weeds that are problematic in these areas, summer annual broadleaves and perennials. Those ones I would try to control as you usually do. Maybe things like deer tongue grass or mugwort, you could potentially reduce the priority of those. But on the other hand, it may be an opportunity to get into those areas when we don't have to worry about tire tracks and things like that, potentially in the summertime. Maybe this is an opportunity. I'm not saying we're going to stay closed for the summer, but maybe there's an opportunity to get some leniency on, on maybe sprayers going in there when you normally wouldn't want to, because you don't want to disrupt that seed head formation that's going to give it the aesthetic. So there's potential on both sides. It probably depends on your situation. You could really go hard after some of these perennial weeds if you've still got a staff and a decent budget, and got the ability to go in there. On the other hand, prioritizing annual weed control if things are lean in terms of budget and staff would be good. And then there's another opportunity to potentially increase the mowing frequency in these roughs. Typically, we're going to mow them once or twice a year. And that's really because we want that aesthetic of those seed heads. Once it produces those seed heads, we really can't mow until the fall. But that lack of mowing is really what causes a lot of these weed problems in there. If you think about the weeds that are in there, they're not really in your fine turf because they don't really tolerate frequent mowing. Things like, especially a lot of the tree saplings and things like that can get a hold. Some of these grasses, and so maybe there's an opportunity if you've got the right staff and the equipment to increase your mowing frequency. If the golfers aren't going to be concerned about that aesthetic, so you could potentially mow, up to maybe once a month, and I think that would really help out some of these weed issues in there. Not saying it's going to eliminate them, but it might reduce their kind of how noxious they are, and especially if you combine it with an herbicide program. I wouldn't decrease the height of mowing. It's still, even a 6-inch mowing or higher once a month is still going to reduce the aggressiveness, I guess you could say, of some of these really problematic weeds. So,
Dr. Elmore, could we go too low with the mow and damage fescue grasses, or even will they begin to get thicker, or maybe promote some migration of turf type tall fescues or rye grasses that might be along the edge?
It's a good point, moving them in there. I'll let Dr. Murphy comment on this if I'm incorrect, but my thinking is that as long as you're keeping it high, you definitely don't want to drop it down to 4 inches or 3 inches or anything, but if you keep it high, 6 to 12 inches, I don't think you'll have any problems. I don't anticipate that you'd thicken it up very much, nor would you see a lot of other grasses moving in there. As long as we're keeping the irrigation off of it. If you start, if you're not able to keep your irrigation system well calibrated, or the heads, you're not able to keep your heads maintained, and you start throwing water into these areas, then you could see weed problems you didn't have, especially with lower mowing. But if you can keep the irrigation out, I think there's an opportunity there.
I would generally agree with what Matt said about the mowing. If you want to institute a mowing program to control weeds or help with that weed control issue, as long as you're just doing it once a month kind of thing and it's really high, you're not going to encourage the density development too much. If you already have too dense a situation, I don't think you're going to see a noticeable influence on density with a really high infrequent mowing program. If that's something you can tolerate, that aesthetic, and help yourself out with some weed control.
Okay. Dr. Elmore, do you have anything else you'd like to let us know about during these times?
I mean, not too much. I'll just quickly, point out a couple potential opportunities if you've got labor. We've got, especially in the southern part of the state, some of these paspalum species. Sometimes we call them Dallas grass. I think there's a lot of field paspalum down there. There's maybe an opportunity, if you're not concerned about aesthetics and playability, to go in and get those weeds if you've got a staff. Physical removal, just digging them out of the ground is one option, or glyphosate is another option. My only concern with glyphosate would be if we've created ourselves a bare area going into summer, or you're just going to have other weeds. But those paspalum species, we really don't have any selective herbicides for them. So again, maybe an opportunity to go after some of those. And we talk a lot about Kalinga in this state now. Maybe this is a potential to go after some of these patches of Kalinga that we haven't wanted to control in the past, because if you control Kalinga in the spring, basically you're going to have a huge void in the summer in areas where it's not mixed well with the turf. So there's a potential to go after some of those weeds a little bit more aggressively. But no, I think that covers it. I think focusing on annual weeds is what I would prioritize.
A recommendation or experience rather with these paspalums, maybe some of these other hard to control species, you're recommending physical removal. Other than physical removal, glyphosate, and with the difficulty of getting our hands on glyphosate these days, is there anything else you've experienced that would work as well, or possibly as a substitute?
Sure. Yeah, fusilade is another option. The problem with fusilade is it's going to be non-selective in a lot of the turf grasses we grow. But if you're in a situation where maybe you want to try some spot treatments and you're not worried about damaging your desirable turf, that would be another option to go after some of these paspalum species.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elmore. Moving on, Dr. Clarke. Again, we're going to stick to the reduction of labor and reduction of budgets. Can you give us some information on disease control?
Sure, Mike, thanks. Yeah, I'd like to follow up on what Jim and Matt were talking about, and that is as stressful as this time is, and it's obviously a really stressful period of time for people. I think there are some opportunities here, particularly from the standpoint of saving some fungicide dollars and maybe extending some of the intervals of control. This is particularly true for superintendents who have been really following best management practices very closely. If they have their fertility in place, and they have for many years, have good density, they've been following practices for top dressing and the application of irrigation and PGRs. This is an opportunity for a lot of superintendents to sort of back away from some of the fungicides, extend some of the intervals, and really just see how effective they can control diseases with some fewer inputs. Having said that, I think you have to approach it from two perspectives. One is the immediate perspective, which is where we are right now. And there's certain key diseases, which if you have if you have problems with diseases like take-all patch or summer patch or fairy ring, this is not the time to back away from your fungicides. You have to put applications in at certain timings, especially with the case of these diseases. They're all soil-borne or thatch-borne diseases. And therefore, you want to time them when the soil temperatures are at the right point to get optimum control. For instance, fairy ring. We want to apply fairy ring fungicides, such as the DMIs or the QOIs, even some of the SDHI fungicides, when the soil temperatures are between 50 and 55 degrees. Some excellent research done by Lane Treadway and Lee Miller when they were at NC State showed that you can get much better control if you time one of these fungicides between 50 and 55 degrees soil temperatures at a 2-inch depth, and essentially almost completely prevent fairy ring for a good part of the year just by timing it critically at that point. So you don't want to delay your fairy ring timings if you have fairy ring. Also, with the root diseases like take-all patch or summer patch, if you had a history of these, you don't want to delay it. If you delay a take-all or summer patch spray, you'll get very poor control even with multiple applications later in the summer. So for people with a history of those problems, when the soil temperatures are right where they are about today, it's almost getting a little too late for your first take-all patch application. So putting out a DMI or a Strobe for take-all patch now, following it up one more time at 21-day interval, you can almost prevent that seeing that problem later on in the year. Summer patch, a little bit later, probably the second, third week in May when the soil temperatures are getting up there to 65 degrees. In the southern part of the state, that might be a little earlier. The northern part of the state, maybe a little later, but 65-degree temperature, 2-inch depth, you want to start your fungicide applications for summer patch. So that's the immediate issue. The long-term issue is a lot more opportunity for reducing your fungicide usage. Diseases like dollar spot, anthracnose. If you follow BMP programs that have been put out by Rutgers and others, you can significantly reduce your fungicides. And in fact, I would say this, diseases like anthracnose, diseases like dollar spot, with a lack of play or with no play, there's no reason why you can't wait until you first see the disease. Early curative applications, and then hit them hard with a combination of some really good, say, a contact and a penetrant fungicide, a premix or a tank mix, hitting it really hard when you first see it, and then backing off and scouting your hot spots until you see it again. Jim mentioned with James Hempfling's work with anthracnose, we were consistently able to reduce our fungicide applications for anthracnose from 10 applications on a standard 14-day interval, like many superintendents have, down to 2 applications with very little disease, particularly on some more tolerant cultivars. Very little disease with 2 applications as long as you have your BMPs in place, which means proper nitrogen applications, proper potassium applications, proper top dressing, and Jim Murphy mentioned this, and this is an opportunity to maybe increase your top dressing a little bit. We've shown that increased top dressing rates will actually reduce anthracnose even more. So, Mike, as much as I say this is a scary time, and it really is, if you've got your key diseases mapped out and you know where to scout for these, I think you can save some dollars and actually show yourself that maybe the 14-day interval that everybody's been on is maybe not actually needed when it really comes down to the nitty-gritty of it.
That's great, Dr. Clarke. I want to touch on that, but first I want to go back a little bit. When we're talking about these soil-borne diseases, now we have no golfers on the golf course. Is this a good time? Is it beneficial to maybe poke some holes before we spray? Or is that a waste of time and labor and we can just spray and water it in and that'll do the job?
Well, that's a great question. And really, it's not a waste of time. And from a different perspective, surely if you aerify or if you spike or if you verticut before you apply a fungicide, you should get better penetration for the root diseases, which is a good thing. But even beyond that, most of the root infecting diseases, particularly when we're talking about take-all patch or summer patch, are known to be much more severe in compacted soils and in heavier soils. So if you're aerifying and you're backfilling with sand, you're reducing compaction, improving rooting, improving the vigor of the turf. Many of these root diseases are significantly less severe throughout the year. So it's a two-pronged benefit. I think, the immediate benefit of getting the fungicide down further is a benefit. The other benefit is improving rooting and reducing the amount of disease through that perspective.
Moving a little further in what you said, you talked about BMPs, that if you're utilizing your BMPs, is this something, start BMPs now, today, am I going to see the long-term effects or rather the benefits of the BMPs and try to reduce that fungicide? Or is this something you had to have your BMPs in place before? Yeah,
that's a very important point. For people who've been following BMPs religiously over the years, they obviously have seen the benefits, and those benefits will continue right to this current year. For people who haven't had the opportunity or haven't been able to maybe follow them as much, this is the time to really pay attention and ratchet down on those BMPs, and you will see benefits, maybe not as quickly as people who have been following them for the past couple of years, but you will see benefits and a noticeable reduction in the severity of some of these outbreaks.
Also, Dr. Clarke, rolling. is rolling going to be beneficial to us in suppressing some of these diseases, or is it something that possibly we can do away with since we don't have golfers and we're not worried about green speeds?
Well, I'll give you my perspective, then I'll punt that off to the expert, Jim Murphy. But from my perspective, yes, rolling can in fact reduce the severity of some diseases like dollar spot and anthracnose. It's not a tremendous reduction, but it surely helps reduce disease. From the standpoint of can we reduce the amount of rolling from the dollar perspective and from the labor perspective, will it have a big impact on disease? Probably not nearly as much as some of the other BMPs. So I think you have to put in perspective, and I'd ask Jim to chime in here and say what he thinks from the standpoint of what's the effect of reducing rolling from the labor and the dollar perspective.
I would agree with Bruce that I think that the effect on disease management is measurable. It may not be as dramatic as some other best management practices, and therefore you could make the argument that maybe some savings in terms of labor with rolling are feasible. But you may also want to be thinking about how rolling fits in with what you're trying to do with mowing. Perhaps you're trying to do less mowing and you want to use rolling to try to, somewhat replace mowing, if you will. I'm not advocating that you let the mowing go so much that the growth gets out of control, but perhaps mixing rolling with, or alternating rolling with mowing might be a management practice that would be something you want to do to try to maintain some surface firmness, especially in your putting greens. Because if you're not mowing them, you're also not rolling them while you mow. We all recognize that when you mow, you're generally also producing a rolling effect with the mower. And if you start alternating every other day with your mowing, you may need to think about adding a rolling just to try to keep some firmness in the surface. Again, the reason I suggest that is because you don't want to get caught in a situation where playing restrictions are now lifted, golfers show up, and all of a sudden you've got kind of fluffy, puffy surfaces, and you start getting those complaints about why aren't the greens firm. So I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer about the rolling question, but I think those are the factors I would be looking at and thinking about to make that decision of whether I wanted to drop it out of my program or keep it in my program.
Okay, great. Dr. Clarke, another question that was out there is taking into consideration utilizing BMPs. You have used your BMPs. Is there a tank mix recommendation that you have to give us the greatest interval between applications for spraying?
I think that, the answer to that question is really based on the diseases you're trying to attack. Certain diseases like dollar spot, there are certain tank mix combination which makes more sense than others. If you have more than one disease you're trying to control, the best thing you can do is to try to pick tank mix partners or premixes that both active ingredients will control those target diseases. And so from my perspective, quite often, as I said before, possibly applying a contact like a chlorothalonil or a fluazanam with a penetrant like a DMI, an SDHI, a QOI fungicide. It often gives you very broad spectrum control and invariably will extend the length of control in many cases. The one thing I didn't mention, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a minute just to talk a little bit about timing of fungicides. And from the standpoint of timing of fungicides, we talked about, some of the root diseases like take-all patch, summer patch, even fairy ring. Timing and soil temperatures in the spring is critical. But there's opportunities out there, and almost all superintendents I know of, they have weather stations they have on the course. And if you have weather stations that are equipped with disease predictive models, that often is an opportunity for you to see when dollar spot is likely to peak in a really big way. And that's a time when you may want to hit the turf with that tank mix combination to really knock the population down before it occurs or just as it's occurring. So there are opportunities to use, I think, some of the new predictive models out there to really get a handle on when these fungicides need to be made rather than just on a calendar basis.
One last thing, Dr. Clarke, if we let some of these diseases go until we see them, and maybe something pops up that we're having a little difficulty identifying, we're not sure what we're looking at, is the lab at Rutgers open during this time?
That's a good question, and basically the answer at this moment is the lab is was taking samples up into about this coming Friday, and then the university is going to be ramping down to a large extent until this COVID crisis is sort of waned. And so, but the good point is that Rich is still working. After next Friday, he'll be working from home. And therefore, you can get a hold of Rich through email. You can get a hold of Rich through, the phone and just ask questions of him, send him pictures. So, he's out there to help you, and he's going to continue to be out there to help as well.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Clarke. Moving on, Dr. Koppenhofer, insect control recommendations. Could you please enlighten us?
Well, you didn't ask it, but I assume you also want to know about cost savings, since that has been a common theme. So, well, one thing, just quickly, raising mowing height, if that makes any sense. We've heard about that already. So within the same limitations, mowing height, raising it can increase the tolerance of grass to insect feeding. It just has more energy. So if within reason, that can help to some extent. How much exactly hasn't really been studied, in detail. So I'm just throwing that out there. Now, then of course, people should really concentrate on their key pests. Now, at this time of the year, for insects, of course, for people in this region, that's most often ABW, annual bluegrass weevil, maybe ants. Now, later in the season, of course, white grub control has to come in. That is really the most common pest, easy to control, but if not controlled, can be catastrophic. Well, so for ABW, things are looking like they're a little bit early this year, so just be aware of that. Although based on the weather forecast now, I think things are cooling down a little bit, so things might be just a week and a half early. So ABW adulticide applications probably need to be going down sometime late third week, maybe during the fourth week of April, but all comes down to monitoring essentially. And so there is one way people can save money if they do not have significant resistance issues. So I've been talking about that for years now, so people should be somewhat aware of that. If they do not have significant resistance issues and adulticides are still effective, they are cheap, of course. So using these adulticides is an important way to get, cut down the populations in a cheap way, and then only follow up as necessary. But with anything, whether adulticide or larvicides, especially now for resistance, but now to save money and labor, really only apply when or if and where necessary, and not everywhere, multiple times. You really gotta, monitor and apply only when and where necessary. So yeah, if no resistance, adulticides, so pyrethroids, chlorpyrifos, they're pretty cheap. And then continue monitoring, at least in problematic areas, for the larvae. So maybe starting before rhododendron starts blooming. And then if you find, only if you find significant larval densities, follow up with a larvicide. And what you can use there, of course, depends on the kind of resistance level one would have. Then, so if there's no significant resistance, the people could then follow up with a aceleperin, which that can still works pretty well as a follow-up to a pyrethroid or chlorpyrifos, and that then at the same time, of course, would take care of caterpillars pretty much at the weevil rate for the rest of the year, pretty much, and of course of white grubs. So no other applications would be necessary. If significant resistance is present, adulticides are really only oil into the flames of resistance. So then don't worry about adulticides. So then the next thing one could do in areas that are more problematic, instead do an early, so just past bloom of dogwood ferens application. And where you can save money there, because ferens of course is expensive, don't use those high rates. I've never seen much of a difference between the 12-ounce So 0.16 pounds AI per acre rate and the higher rates. And given how expensive this material, I would go with that 12-ounce rate. It seems to do the trick, really. I mean, it's not a big difference, especially when you go early. So you can save some money there. And then only do that in areas which are known to be problematic. In areas where you really haven't seen so many problems, just monitor for larvae, and then if necessary, do, then an application of some larvicide during rhododendron full bloom. So that can reduce costs for insecticides a lot. Then another thing to save money, well, Dr. Elmore and I, through Dr. Elmore's grad student, Katie Deal, have been doing research, which we also would like to continue, where we have seen that, people have kind of done that, some people before it, but you can basically use ABW to suppress Pora annua. So now instead of trying to wipe out the ABWs, you can actually control them at a much lower level, only if really necessary, and let them actually, then they're less of a problem. And the Pora actually, if it's wet enough, has quite an ability to come back anyway. So it's it doesn't really necessarily get wiped out, especially if there's no Gulf going on right now. So it's not as dramatic if you get some transient damage. And so let the weevils control the Pora while you don't have to spend money on controlling the weevils. But you can really only do that in areas where the Pora is relatively low, and that's something we don't know yet exactly. Let's say if it's no more than 25%, so just to throw out a cautious number, and if it's nicely mixed in, you're not going to notice the damage that weevils might be doing so much anyway. If you have pure Pora patches, or let's say more than 50% of Pora, maybe that might not work. But anyway, that's a potential way to save money. Instead of controlling the weevils, only control them if really necessary, once you start seeing some damage. And some research we've done there, so we found there's a lot of these insecticides, let's say Ferens and Dialox and Provant, they work actually at least through the end of bloom rhododendron. After that, they start to lose it. So if you go later than that, then probably match point is your best choice. But eventually, if you go way past rhododendron full bloom, that also starts to lose it. So anyway, those are some ways you could save some money for one of the major pests, ABW.
Dr. Koppenhofer, in terms of, and I'd like to go through a list of insects here, in terms of what you just said to us in saving money, can we harm ourselves in any way, shape, or form by possibly allowing infestations or populations to get too high? Firstly, with the ABW, do you foresee that as maybe we'll get through this year, but then business is as usual next year, and perhaps because we didn't treat certain areas or got a little eased up a little too much, possibly, could we see a problem of a greater population of ABWs the following year, and regret possibly reducing too much?
Well, it's hard to say, it depends on a case-to-case basis, but I've worked on various golf courses where they're lower end, but they don't treat their fairways except for grub control with, like imidacloprid. And the weevils are there. Sometimes they cause some damage, but most of the years they're not such a big issue, and they have not exploded. I think where weevil populations tend to be exploding is where people have been pushing really hard. And if you then back up, maybe that could be problematic. But people haven't really studied that in any kind of detail. So yeah, maybe I would be cautious. So I wouldn't, you don't want to stop controlling them altogether, but you don't need to push them as hard as some people do.
Similar with the ants that you spoke about, I mean, really their aesthetic and playability issue, not really damaging turf so much. Is that something we can back off or even eliminate for this season? And then as golf comes back, can we start to treat them more?
Well, I think the ants, they're not going to explode over from one year to the other. But ants can be relatively cheaply, at least suppressed quite well, if not controlled, with applications of a neonicotinoid. And for example, generic imidacloprid is pretty cheap. So that could be then basically can combine the white grub control with the ant control. People over the last years or so have seen more problem with ants, in part because people have switched to a celloprene, which is a great material, but it's not very effective. Doesn't really do much against ants. And so the neonicotinoids are more effective against ants because they don't kill them that quickly like pyrethroid would, but it allows the ants to bring the material on their body back to the nest, and then they lick their body, they get it into their crop, and then they share food, and that way they share also the insecticide, and it can get to the queen that way, and you can eliminate the nest that way. So yeah, if you then could combine grub control with ant control in those areas using like imidacloprid, that can be relatively cheap. And yeah, given that there's no golf, if there's no golf going on, you probably don't have to do it as hard as you might do in some other years.
To that same effect, trying to save money, insects that are pests to humans, ticks and so forth, is this something that do you recommend maybe not spraying for them because there's no golfers out there, or is this also a relatively cheap treat and we should continue and keep the populations down?
Well, ticks, I think, probably among other things most easily controlled with pyrethroids. And so, if you use like your generic products, they're pretty cheap. And that's, of course, when it comes to human health, then it's a little bit more problematic. So I wouldn't back off too much there. You can always monitor, I'm not an expert on that, but it's pretty easy to monitor for ticks by using like a white big piece of cloth and drag that over an area, and then you can see the ticks attaching on them, and on the white cloth they're pretty easy to see, and it gives you an idea how many are out there. And so yeah, you could maybe use that and then only treat areas which tend to have a lot of ticks.
Okay. Is there anything else that you feel we need to know, Dr. Koppenhofer? Dr. Clarke, Dr. Clarke would like to add to that?
I was going to add simply that there are a couple of things I just wanted to touch on, because I've gotten a lot of questions recently from superintendents, with the reduction in labor and with the reduction in budgets, they're often concerned about Pythium control, and they're asking about phosphites. And basically phosphites are very effective short-term suppression preventively for Pythium. And I think many people have those into their budgets, are relatively inexpensive. So they will give you some nice protection on a preventive basis for short terms, 10 to 14 days. But if you get into a major Pythium outbreak or weather in mid-July that's really conducive to, hot, hazy, humid weather, really conducive to Pythium with nighttime temperatures well above 70, that's often where you have to bring in some of the bigger hitters. And so I'm just simply saying that people should not rely entirely on phosphites, especially when the conditions are really conducive to that disease. And then the last thing I wanted to say is, and it's critical, I should have mentioned it earlier, but if people are putting together a fungicide program and it's different than their standard program because they want to try to save some money, they really need to address an unbiased source of disease control information. Good example is the manual that we put out, which is called Chemical Control of Turfgrass Diseases with the University of Kentucky and University of Wisconsin. And if people just simply Google PPA-1, they'll get that up there. And that gives them a very good idea on which chemicals, which fungicides to use for specific disease problems they anticipate.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Clarke. Does anyone have anything else that they'd like to add to this panel discussion that we've had?
Mike, one thing that I would just point out, similar to what Bruce just talked about regarding, material options, if you're really looking to save money and you're not already using some straightforward nitrogen fertilizer sources like urea or ammonium sulfate as your primary end source, that would be an opportunity for saving money. Those products tend to run a lot cheaper than some of the value-added products that are out there.
Okay, great. Well, once again, gentlemen, I'd love to thank you for your time, your efforts, and all the incredible knowledge that you've given to our membership and superintendents out there. This will be a great help, I think, for them. And once again, I'd like to thank Maureen Sharples and Todd Rash for their contribution and efforts in making this happen. In closing, I just want to say to all the superintendents out there, I think what we heard is that don't stray too far from the path. Don't panic. It's a stressful time. Don't let the stresses of outside affect how you conduct your business at the course. You know what you're doing. This is a great resource. Check back over and over. Listen to it multiple times if you have to. And just know that it's keep it simple and you'll be okay. That being said, also go to the cdc.gov to learn or remind yourself and your crew how to stay healthy. There's a lot of good stuff on there. It's right on the main page. Instructions for personal cleanliness, right to a list of instructions and products to properly sterilize, clean, and sanitize. And they're two different things. You want to clean and sanitize. And that's best, because if you're not healthy, you can't be at the property, then you can't keep your turf healthy. That's the main ingredient, guys. So again, thank you all. Thank you for your time, and stay safe and keep your turf green.
Thanks very much, Mike.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Take care, everyone.